Hi, welcome to another episode of the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm Steve Richardson, a bankruptcy attorney trying to keep people on their path to financial stability and independence through education. Now, there are many ways to save and invest for retirement, or just build wealth, and most are recommended by traditional financial advisors. But sometimes it's a good idea to explore some non traditional ways to do it that might be better suited to your situation. That's why in this episode of the podcast, I talked to Chris Miles, a self described anti financial advisor who walks that road less traveled with his clients to help them reach their own financial freedom. My guest today is Chris Miles, a cash flow expert and anti financial advisor who's a leading authority on teaching entrepreneurs and professionals how to get their money working for them today. He's been featured on U.S. News, CNN Money, Entrepreneurs on Fire, Blogger, Bigger Pockets, and has proven a reputation with his company, Money Ripples, getting his clients fast financial results. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Steve.
Yeah. I before we started recording, I mentioned that one of the things that interested me when you contacted me, when you reached out, was that you're an anti-financial advisor. Well,
Mhm.
we're coming up on 200 episodes on the Financial Freedom Podcast, and you start going over the same ground after a while. And I've talked to lots of financial advisors, so it was refreshing to see an anti-financial advisor. I didn't even know that was a thing. Uh,
It
what
is
what
now.
is an anti-financial advisor? I guess is the first big question.
Oh, it's someone that says, "Don't listen to any of the advice those financial advisors gave on the previous podcast episodes you did." That's what it really means.
Don't listen to those guys.
Don't listen to those guys. They're just salesmen in suits. That's what they are. And the reason to kind of give you more of a backstory on that, the reason I say that's because I used to be one, right? I
Okay.
used to be that guy that was pretty much trying to tell you that you just pay off all your debt, like Dave Ramsey says, and you save it forever in these mutual funds, and hopefully someday you'll have something. And I'll tell you, like I was raised in the mentality of save everything, spend nothing, kind of scarcity mentality when it came to money. My dad was like the ultimate penny pincher, that kind of thing. And so, I realized that when I went out to the real world, at first I was going to become a business consultant, but then I realized I should probably have real life business experience before I just try to tell people what to do with their businesses. So I actually dropped out of college with one class to go, just to take a temporary sabbatical, supposed to be temporary, and find some business to start that I could do, and then eventually I would come back and finish my MBA. Well, long story short, the first business I found that intrigued me was becoming a financial advisor because I thought, worst case, I learn about money, and maybe I'll even give my dad some of his life back because he kept telling me growing up, he said, you know what? I'm probably going to die working my job. My job, the stress from it would probably literally kill me. And I
Oh,
thought, if I can give my dad some of his life back, maybe that would be worthwhile. So, about almost 4 years in, my dad reaches out to me, says, okay, Chris, you've been a financial advisor for a while now. When are you going to actually advise me? Never thought he would ask that because remember, he changed my diapers. So I never thought he would actually listen to anything I had to say. But, he, for the first time in my life, he actually opened up his books to show me what money was because he was very guarded about his money. And I looked at it. I said, all right, dad, you're 61 years old. If you want to retire today, and even though you've paid off your house, you're 100% debt free, you've been stuffing money in these 401ks for decades now. The only issue is if you want to retire today, you better hope you die in 5 years because that's when you're going to run out of money. Okay, Chris, that's not what I wanted to hear. What else can I do? And I said, I don't know, Dad. You did everything right according to what I teach as a financial advisor. I mean, you've done all the things that I teach, and I could try to put you in this, stock type investment or this one. But the truth is I don't know if it's going to work. I don't want to gamble your money away and then be wrong, and then you have to blame me the rest of your life. So I don't want that. So I was lost. I didn't know what to do because it really bugged me that I was selling the dream. I was selling people hopium, right? Help sell the hope that someday they'll be able to retire. And here's my dad, who was like the poster child for doing it right, and it wasn't enough. And of course, a few weeks later, it's like when the student's ready, the teacher appears. The teacher wasn't what I expected, though. It was actually a guy I trained to be a financial advisor that quit on me to go do real estate investing. And he partnered up with his dad, and his dad and him were doing some real estate deals. And the next thing I know, I'm asking them how they're doing. And after 4 or 5 months, he says, yeah, it's amazing. My dad's now doubled his income as a professor at the local university. I said, "Oh, come on. That's too good to be true. There's no way you can make money like that." And he finally stopped me. He said, "Chris, how many of your clients are actually financially free where they don't worry about money?" I said, "Oh, you had to throw in that last part. Thanks." They all worry about money. So I have to say none, unfortunately, by that definition. But they're retired ones. They're just retired desperate. He's like, "Okay, great. Good job, Chris. Well, how about this? How many of you guys as financial advisors are financially free, not off the commissions you're earning, but actually doing these financial investments that you've been recommending?" And as I really was honest with myself, and I was thinking through the office, there's guys that have been working in that field since the late 1970s, and yet they couldn't retire either. And that's when I realized, I said, "You know what? Maybe none. Maybe none of them can." There's your problem, Chris. And that kind of got me down a different matrix type rabbit hole. I took the red pill to kind of see what was different, what else could happen here, and find out that really he was right. I mean, it wasn't working for people. People, even in clients I inherited from decades of financial advisors before me, still couldn't retire themselves, at least not comfortably. And so after a few months of trying to make it all work, I finally had to quit. It was either my integrity stayed intact or I just put my head down and ignored the facts. And so I chose the former, obviously. I quit, vowed never to teach about money again. I was just going to be a mortgage broker and then I would teach ballroom dancing on the side. That was my 2006 plan, right?
Mhm.
And so, in any case, but at the same time, I wanted to learn how guys like him and others were retiring with real estate. I wanted to know what I was missing. And eventually, later that next year, I was able to retire myself, where I was 28 years old, almost 29, and I was able to quit. And of course, when you do that, when you're 28 years old, people want to know, well, how in the heck did you do that? So eventually, whether I liked it or not, people kept asking me those questions. And so 2007, I came out of retirement to teach people how I did what I did, and how to essentially have enough income, passive income coming in from investments and things like that, that you're work optional. You work because you want to, not because you have to. And that's really what I'm teaching to this day, is getting people to break free of those chains that financial advisors put on you, and the whole financial world, really. If you think about it, the Dave Ramseys and the Susie Ormans, they all teach the same crap they've heard your entire life. But yet, look at the statistics. Look at Fidelity. Fidelity came out with their stats showing that and this is just as of recently, just in the last few weeks, the stats came out that said that of their 45 million clients, only 810,000 have at least $1 million. So do the math, just a little over 1.5% have at least $1 million. But there's a catch, because in the traditional financial world, at least with people that have real updated numbers, not the people that lie to you, you should only be pulling out 3% a year max if you never want to run out of money when you're retired. Well, do the math. 3% of $1 million is only 30,000 a year. So you're a broke millionaire. You're living below the poverty line as a millionaire, just so that you don't run out of money in case the market swings back and forth and you start to lose money, especially with inflation and everything else. And so that's why when they did a separate survey, Transamerica did a survey of those with over $1 million, 35% said it will take, quote, a miracle to be able to retire, because of that very reason I just mentioned about not having enough, that 3%. And so think about it. About 1.5% have $1 million, but over a third of them don't think they'll be able to make it. That means really only about 1% of the population thinks, hey, you know what? I think I've got a shot here. you know,
Mhm.
that's pretty bad statistics. That means 99% failure rate. If I went on Google to look up a restaurant, they had 99 one-star reviews and only one five-star review. I can guarantee you I'm not going to pay attention to that five-star review from their mom. Okay. That's what's happening in the financial advisor world right now, is that we're seeing bad evidence, but still people teach it as if it still works.
Well, now you mentioned earlier, and I have a two-part question. You said that your father did everything right, and he still couldn't last 5 years in retirement. So, first
Yeah.
question is, what all was he doing? You mentioned the 401k, but what all was he doing that was quote unquote right? And the second question is, why wasn't that working?
Yeah, so he paid off his debt. I mentioned that he was debt free. So if you follow guys like Dave Ramsey, which I don't recommend, but if you want good entertainment value, he's a great guy to follow. But he teaches you to be that the real secret is get debt free and then save your money in mutual funds, and you should make 12% a year, right? And then eventually you'll be able to pull off like 8% a year, which he actually did say on a video recently that everybody's hammering him about. So that you should be able to retire just fine, because everybody makes 12% a year in the stock market. Here's the one problem. And by the way, I kind of taught this too. In the early 2000s, early and mid 2000s, we actually still taught that the market, the small cap stocks averaged 12% because we got those charts since 2000 BC that'll show you if you invest $1 in 1928, eventually you'll have $50,000, those kind of things, right? Well, and then of course they say that the large cap like the S&P 500 averages 10.8. It doesn't. That's not the real returns of those markets.
Hmm.
In fact, it's much worse. And
Mhm.
and that's the problem. So my dad, again, stuffing money into his retirement plan at work, getting the company match, which everybody tells you is a no-brainer, right? He paid off all his debt, including his house. So he didn't have to spend money on debt, right? He was debt-free and packing money into his 401k. But despite all of that, still he only had about at that time about roughly $250,000 saved up. Supposed to
Well,
be enough, but again, you're living on 3%. Even 3% of 300,000 is 9,000 a year. He was
mhm.
spending, he was only living about a 50,000 a year lifestyle, right? He needed about 4,000 a month. Yeah, he had Social Security that could kick in eventually at some point, but it was not nearly enough for him to be able to last.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned about he paid off his mortgage. Uh,
Mhm.
I mean that can be a good or a bad thing. I mean, if he paid off his mortgage, and I mean, and he had an interest rate that was fairly far below the average rate of return of an investment, he's better
Mm,
off leaving that money in the investment, which will grow in excess of what he's paying in interest, and then
yep.
just let it naturally pay off. So, the idea of being debt free, I think he took it a little too far in paying off his mortgage. Because I
Yeah.
mean, the idea of being debt free is you don't have any credit card debt, your student loans are
Mhm.
paid off, all the high interest stuff and everything that's clear. People have mortgages and they have car loans, but if that's the only debt they have, then they could be better off just continuing to pay that mortgage and that interest rate, and letting that money grow and not taking it out, paying it off the mortgage, because you're then losing that future growth. So I think
That's
that
right.
may have been one of the mistakes he made. And I don't know
That's
whether Dave
exactly it,
Ramsey
Steve.
teaches that, but
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like that's common sense, right? It makes sense. Yeah. If I can out earn what I'm paying on the interest, and truthfully, you don't even have to out earn the interest because if you
Mhm.
compound it, you beat the
Right.
simple interest of the mortgage anyways. So if you have a 4% mortgage, if you earn about a 1.8% return on your money, you can beat the interest of the mortgage, right? For compounding interest. That's a whole nother conversation too. Maybe we go down that rabbit hole, maybe not.
Uh,
But back to your point, right? Like you're right. I mean, we actually in that meeting that I had with him, we did entertain. He's like, well, what else can I do? I said, well, you got your house, you've got equity in it. You could do a cash out refinance. And at that time, the refinance rates were roughly about, 6% to do
mhm.
that, 5.5 to 6%. Not too much different than they are today. But the hard thing was, I said, but dad, I can't guarantee that I'll beat that rate because what if the market goes down? And remember, this was the end of 2005 when I was talking to him about this
Uh,
stuff. So it was only just 2 years later, the market tanked. So I'm glad I didn't say, you should probably throw it in the stock market because it only had one good up year after that until it had 2007 and 8 and 9. Well, finally, 9, it started to recover. He would have lost a good chunk of money there. But that was one option. It was like, well, you got equity here, but he's like, well, where do I invest it? I'm like, I don't know. Because if you throw it in the market, you might not be able to make that money back. And that's why really financial advisors have a hard time teaching cash out your money to put in the market, which by the way is actually illegal. Because if you put it into mutual funds, one of the things you sign off on the disclosure says, did I borrow money to invest in the market? Because that was the mistake they made in the Great Depression and put us in a much bigger crisis. So you actually sign off saying, I did not borrow money to put in the stock market.
wow. Okay. So that's what he did everything right. He got rid of his debt. He paid into his 401k, so he got the matching funds, which I mean, there is good in that. I mean, it's an immediate 100% return on your investment with those
Right.
matching funds. So it's good if your employer offers that, to get that, put your money in that, and then it's something in like a Roth where you don't have to take it out immediately. You have the ability to grow as a hedge against inflation in future. But sometimes that isn't enough, I guess, depending upon what your income level is and
Right.
what your cost of living is, at least in retirement.
Mhm.
So that's what he's doing wrong, and I guess that's why. I mean, one of the things you talk about, and we talked about before we started um, the recording, was that it was your considered opinion that the mainstream financial advice, quite bluntly, sucks. And I think you
Yeah.
kind of demonstrated that as far as what uh, it's difficult to save enough money to begin with. And you think, oh, I've saved $1 million. I'm a millionaire. I'm okay. But
Mhm.
if you're trying to live on that without invading principal, and what is your likelihood of how long you're going to live in retirement, and when do you plan on
Right.
retiring? This fire movement that you hear about, I guess that you were part of for a short period of time.
Mhm.
Yeah, financially independent and retired early, but it's a lot easier to run out of money if you do it at that point, because you may have run up a couple million, and then you try and live off that corpus. Well, if you've got another 40, 50 years ahead of you, you're
Mhm.
probably going to outlive your money. So I
That's
think to
right.
some extent your father was 61.
Mhm.
When what your retirement horizon is, and what your and whether you think you're going to outlive your money, because if you're probably not going to, then you don't necessarily have to live on that 3%. You can invade principal and roll it into something a little bit more stable, so it's not, because you're not relying on growth per se in retirement,
Right.
and then start invading a principal. And $1 million, you know 10 years is $100,000 a year, 20 years is 50 a year, and
Mhm.
too bad with Social Security and maybe some other things.
Mhm.
But as long as you don't live another longer than 15, 20 years into retirement, you're okay. But there's always that
Right.
risk. So would you say
That's
it's
right.
fairly, case by case, fact dependent as far as what your uh, cost of living is, when you intend to
Mhm.
retire, where you're living? Uh, for
Absolutely.
example, one thing I talked about with other guests is geographic arbitrage. You
Mhm.
may $1 million now wherever you're located may not have lasted them very long, maybe 5 years. But if you're retired to a more tax friendly, cost of living friendly state, then you might be able to live longer on the same amount of money. So would you
That's
say
right.
that considering geographic arbitrage might be something to look at as far as retirees are concerned?
Oh, absolutely. The big warning is don't let cost of living be what wags. It's kind of like the cost of living tail wagging the dog,
Yeah.
right? Don't be like, I'm gonna go live a place that I really don't want to live in, but it's cheap. You don't want to go into that scarcity mode. But absolutely. Let me give you two examples of clients of ours that this is exactly what they did, and they're contrasted, right? So I have one client, 60 years old, retired from the military. He had exactly $1 million in his retirement accounts. And he went to his financial advisor who said, okay, well, if you pull off 3%, that means you can pull off 30,000 a year. He said, I live, even though he doesn't live on the west side of California, he's more on the east side. He said, there's no way. This is California.
Yeah.
Homeless people live on 30,000 a year. So I can't do that. So he that's why he ended up, going down the podcast rabbit hole, found us, found our Money Ripples podcast show, and then he reached out to us and he hired us as consultants. And we looked at things like, turnkey properties, right? Where somebody else manages property for you and you don't have to self-manage and have another job, but somebody else manages it. So you get about a few duplexes. He got in some oil and gas deals that pay out some consistent, money because they get paid on rent, not just the royalties. And then also he did some things with like apartments and whatnot. And so between all those things, getting that money deployed, he has about between 100 to 130,000 a year he's able to live on now, instead of
Mhm.
the 30,000 a year that the financial advisor said he could do.
Mhm.
That's one big difference. Again, it's about the passive income. It's the cash flow that comes from it without touching the principal too, right? Like you
Right.
mentioned, don't even touch the principal. You have to like kill that golden goose or starve it to death until you get to 80 years old, and then the golden goose is emaciated and pretty much there's no meat left on the bones, right? So you don't want to do that. Now, on the other side, I had a couple that they're in their 40s. They're much younger. They still have a family they're raising. Their big thing was they said, you know what, we want to actually be able to homeschool our kids and travel wherever we want to go, like basically
Mhm.
be expats in another country.
Mhm.
So they kind of tried Costa Rica, they tried Mexico. They're now living in Cabo San Lucas for the last 4 years now.
Mhm.
And that's pretty much what they do. Like they got about 4,000, 5,000 a month coming in passive income. It's plenty for them to be able to live on. Plus, She has a little side business that she makes some money on as well that helps, give them some extra cash. But, they're living the dream life that they want. Now, if someone were living in like a level 4, level 5 state of Mexico, and they know that they can get killed at any moment just going out in the streets, or they're going to get their kids kidnapped, that's not the right case, right?
Right.
It's cheap, but you might die. You don't want that kind of thing. But for them, I mean, they're living in Cabo. I mean, I just went there for the first time a couple months ago, and I thought, my goodness, I can see why people live here. It's expensive in some ways, but man, it's awesome in others too.
Yeah, there are a lot of factors that come into it. And I did a show with a guy about it. We talked about this, and uh, I mean, it can be socially isolating because you're moving to a place where you don't know anybody.
That's true.
So it depends upon your lifestyle. If you and your spouse are just enjoy retirement, hanging out together, doing things together, and you don't really need that social outlet, then that's
Mhm.
fine. But you're moving to a whole new area and kind of starting over. And you might
Yeah.
consider maybe uh either doing a long-term rental someplace to see if you like it first before buying. And then, or if you're going to buy, you may just want to rent, depending upon what the environment is. Story I told that he was a New Jersey, he was a sheriff's officer in Central Jersey, and he was retiring, and he took some money and he bought a condo in Florida,
Mm.
financed it, and he said he's lived more than half the year in Florida, never sold his New Jersey property, lived more
Mhm.
than half the year in Florida. The money he saved in taxes more than paid for the condo.
Yeah.
So he never sold his old place, never had to leave and move permanently to Florida as long as he lives at least 181 days, or this year 182
Yep.
in that state, qualifies as that as his domicile. He's paying Florida taxes and not New Jersey taxes. So there's that hybrid as
Exactly.
well. But it's something to consider very seriously and very carefully, I would think.
Isn't that awesome? I mean, there's so many different ways you can do it, right? There's so many ways you can create this thing to work. And like you mentioned the fire movement before, you'd think the fire movement would love me, right?
Hmm.
Because I did it for one. I actually did it. I'm not just talking about it. I actually did it myself.
Yeah.
And I've helped others do the same thing. But the funny thing is they kicked me out of the Facebook group. You want to know why? Because I started calling calling the bull on them. And you kind of mentioned it too, but a lot of them will teach that you can invest in the stock market and you can live on 4%. Well, if you're say in your 30s trying to live on that 4%, well, those Monte Carlo simulations, they still say that 3% is okay. And they change all the time. They're changed on
Yeah.
based on government reporting of inflation, which we know is all padded. That's
Mhm.
not real numbers. They also based it on whether or not they think the stock market will go up or down, in the near future, which doesn't mean squat.
Mhm.
So they're thinking that 4% is enough. But I can guarantee a lot of those people, if they were in their 30s, wouldn't last to their 60s before they have to generate more income because they're
Mhm.
going to lose. And again, they can gamble their money. They think they're going to be just fine and they can just live cheap forever.
Mhm.
That's just not reality. I mean, you and I have been around long enough. You've probably been around maybe a little bit more than me, but we've been around for several decades to see that no, inflation sucks.
Mhm.
And it's prevalent, especially after they took us off the gold standard in the 70s. So it's one of those things that you got to account for. And that's why trying to go the traditional route just doesn't work. If you want to be financially independent, retire early and use the stock market, I wouldn't
Mhm.
pull out more than 2% a year.
Mhm.
So that means you got to have 50 times your annual income to be able to retire. So if somebody saves $1 million, they say, "Oh, I can pull off 4%, 40,000 years enough." No, you got to live on maybe half that, 20,000 a year to make sure you don't run out of money if you're going to keep gambling the markets. Where again, my clients don't have that problem. Like some of them will invest lending out their money to other real estate investors that contractually will pay them 10, 11, 12 or more percent a year.
Hmm.
So they can get predictable income. It's not like, well, the market should average this, which nobody really, it's funny because most of those people don't even know the real average of the stock market. It's actually just barely over 8% in the last 30 years as a real rate of return, not 12, definitely
Mhm.
not even 10. It's like 8.1 is what it's been when I updated a couple weeks ago. That's the 30-year average. And that's with a low before a recession in the 90s, 94, till now we're at an all-time high. Usually it's between 7 and 8%.
Mhm.
So when people say, "Oh, it's 12%," like you're wrong. And Chris, you didn't factor in dividends reinvested. Well, you didn't factor in fees either, and you didn't even factor in taxes and everything else. So you're lucky to get 7 or 8% in the market. that changes the whole scenario. That changes all the numbers and the assumptions to where you really got to save at least double what you thought you were going to have to save.
Well, it's interesting on the fire movement. I actually interviewed a married couple that had written a book on the fire movement, and
Mhm.
the title of the book escapes me. But the same thing. I think she was an engineer. They had these high end jobs, and they reached like 1.3, 1.4 million in their early 30s, and then they retired.
Mhm.
And the story they tell is that, well, we'll travel around the world, get that out of our systems for a year and see what happens. So they
Yeah.
travel around the world. They get back to the States, and they realized it cost them less money to live traveling around the world than it
Mhm.
did if they had stayed home.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I first learned about geographic arbitrage, because
Yeah.
and now this is very extreme. They're traveling around on 2 backpacks each. Okay, talking about
Right.
very minimal, and talking about lying on the beach in Vietnam or something and just relaxing, a very low cost of living, and a few months there, and then they go to like a high cost of living place, like England or something like that, where it's very different, but not the whole time. And
Yeah.
they even said in their book, this isn't for everybody. you know,
Mhm.
you had to have this nomadic lifestyle. And they talk about pulling 4%, but
Mhm.
they're all around the world. They're doing this geographic arbitrage where it costs them very little to live, but I don't envy them when they're our age, 50s, 60s, and they're like, I'm too old for this stuff. What do you do then?
Exactly. Well, I remember I was asked that same question when I was 28, right before I got to that point where I could be just like them, right? Where I was fire.
Yeah.
And and I remember one of my friends, he was a millionaire, he asked me, he said, "Chris, if money were no issue, what would you spend your time doing?" And I said the very thing that almost anybody says, which is whatever you're not doing, that's what usually people will say as the answer, as a knee-jerk reaction. And I said, travel. He said, "Chris, let's be honest. Are you really going to travel 52 weeks out of the year?" No, actually, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
And I was still 28 with a young family. I said, "No, that sounds miserable, actually." He said, "What would you do the other 45 weeks out of the year?" And I was like, "Wow, that's a good question." I said, "Well, I don't know. Maybe I teach ballroom dancing. Maybe I just do that instead." I'm like, "That's a good question." And that's the thing. Like some people would love to travel 52 weeks out of the year, but I've noticed when we've talked with thousands of people, vast majority want the freedom to travel, but they don't want to become full-time travelers. Like they want a home base. They want a place to
Right.
come home to that they could say, "This is where I am." I want the freedom to travel. They want the free. Really, more people want that. They still want to keep working. I mean, the whole concept of retirement is becoming a more dead concept because, and I know this for myself too because I was able to retire twice by the time I was 40 and the only reason it was twice because I screwed up the first time. That's why. Um, but I had to retire a second time, and even every time I tried to do it, I couldn't just stop working. I felt depressed. I felt useless. I felt I had no purpose. So I had to keep doing something. And so more people are wanting to become just work optional. They want the ability to be able to quit whenever they want, or to not go to work, or not show up to their business, but they still want to keep doing something that brings meaning to their life too.
Well, it uh, sounds like a principle that was discussed by Tim Ferriss in the 4 hour
Mhm.
work week, where he said we had this whole idea that we work and slave for 40 years and then we
Mhm.
retire. Well, why wait? Have these, little retirements throughout your life and really enjoy
That's
it.
right.
And the whole idea of the 4 hour work week is that you built up a business and get it to the point where it doesn't need you anymore, and you can step back and maybe spend 4 hours a week seeing how things are going, everything fine, whatever it is, it can run
Yeah,
without you. So now it's generating income, and you can have these little um, retirements. There are people that do
that's right.
a 1 or 2 week sabbatical every quarter.
Mhm.
So
That's right.
that is sort of an interesting compromise where you get to a financial position where you can coast for a month or two and travel and do some interesting things. And then when it's time to come home, it's time to come home, and you keep
Mhm.
busy, but you're enjoying retirement now rather than later. So maybe we need
Exactly.
to, and you look at the studies done by the authors of the Millionaire Next Door, where
Mhm.
I think he said a majority of all American millionaires are self-employed.
Yeah,
So really, to get to that point, that's what you have to do. And
that's
Quitting
right.
Like a Millionaire is the name of the book. Quitting Like a Millionaire. I just realized,
Yeah.
but
No,
it's an
it's
interesting
true. You
book.
can do like little mini type of retirements, right? I mean,
Mhm,
that's the fun thing because like one thing that stretched my paradigm on this was
mhm,
even though I had been financially independent, I couldn't figure out how to like let myself be free, right?
mhm,
Not truly. And I remember I went through a divorce 2015. I got remarried in 2016, and one of the agreements that my wife made me make to her, she says, if I'm going to marry you, I have two conditions. One, no more kids because between the two of us, we got 8 children, no
mm,
more. So she's like, Chris, it's not going to be me, it's you. You got to take care of that, you know. And then secondly, I can't do any more Utah winters because she's like, I'm from Venezuela. I can't handle the cold winters. I need to get away.
mhm,
I said, all right, let's do it. And I was scared to death. I was like, can we really do it? We're going to leave for 2.5 months to just go live somewhere else. And
mhm,
it worked well because, we were newly married. Had just both been renting. So we were free to kind of go wherever we wanted. And so we did that. We went to California, Southern California and spent a couple months there. And, uh, and it was awesome. It was great. And funny enough, it didn't cost as much as I thought. And some reason in my mind, I blew up to be like, well, it's going to cost so much. And in truth, it was a little bit more expensive than just living in Utah, because of course it's California too, and you're paying Airbnbs and whatnot. But it wasn't that bad. And so we've been doing that every single year since then, where we've gone anywhere from like Texas to Florida to Hawaii a couple times and, Mexico and places like that just to try to get away for the winter, get some
mhm.
vitamin D while, people in Utah are freezing to death, and that's been fun. And the thing is like, and I still do more travel than that, but it's kind of cool if you just try to test it out. Just try it out, because if you have savings, if you've got even passive income coming in, you can do that. You can have flexibility. You can have options. That's why I love passive income, right? In fact, my shirt even says it. I love it because that
Well,
because
let's
it's the
talk
very
about
thing.
that. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
because you've been discussing it and mentioning it quite a bit, and uh, how does passive income or building passive income work with this non-mainstream financial advising? In addition to the traditional investments in mutual funds, IRAs, 401ks, how
Mhm.
does this building of passive income, which doesn't tie money to time,
Yeah.
therefore ultimately scalable, how does that play into the investment and financial advice that you give to your clients?
Yeah, it's not so much different, and we work more as consultants. We're not investment advisor or anything like that, but we're more strategists and connectors.
Uh-huh.
Because the one problem you have to undo, the belief you have to undo, is that you got to get your money out of prison,
Uh-huh.
because everything's taught in the financial world to lock your money up, like we talked about earlier about paying off your house, right? Lock your money up by throwing it at the bank. But then if you want to get it back out, you have to ask them for permission if you want to refinance, or you have to sell the property. You have to get rid of it. You may not want to do that.
Right.
So one is don't lock your money up in equity. Like what you said is, if I'm going to pay payments, pay minimum payments on my mortgage, especially if it's cheap interest rates.
Mhm.
And then two, get your money out of prison. Like don't lock it up in 401ks where literally you have to either quit or lose your job to get real true liquidity of your 401k. Because
Uh-huh.
otherwise you're either borrowing it. Well, pretty much you can only borrow it. That's about your only option with the 401k. So rather than trying to borrow it from them and then you have to pay it back every single paycheck, it's being pulled out on top of whatever you're trying to contribute. Instead, if you get your money saved outside of those programs, outside of the IRAs where they slap you with 10% penalties and taxes if you try to pull it out before you're 59 and a half or whatever age they choose for you at that time,
Uh-huh.
instead of doing that, find ways to keep your money liquid. It could just simply be a savings account, right? It could be something like that. Or it could be like we talk about a concept like infinite banking, which is another place you can store it. It's like a tax-free savings account. But you store that money in your liquidity and then you get it out. So I tell people is get lean, get liquid, and get out. Get your cash flow under control. That's get lean, right? So you don't have to be cheap. You don't have to live on rice and beans, but be a wise steward of your money.
Uh-huh.
Get liquid means to get your money out of that prison, like get that money available so it can be used to get it out into places where it can produce steady, predictable cash flow, passive income. And that
Well,
could be things
how do
like
you
various
get
types of real
how do you
estate.
stay liquid but still get better rates of return than if the money was locked up?
Well, one thing that people don't realize is that 0% is not your worst rate of return. Think about this, and I heard this complaint all the time early on because I've been doing this for 22 years, right? And
Uh,
so I remember people telling me, really until 2015, people kept saying, "Wow, the money I put into the market I had in the year 2000 before it tanked in Y2K, it
uh,
still hasn't come back yet." It wasn't until 2015 where those people started to say, "I finally got my money back." Because
uh,
the market tanked. Like it came back up a little bit after Y2K, but then it had the Great Recession. It tanked again, went even lower.
mhm,
And so then it fought its way back, but it was 15 years before you finally got your money back. But guess what? Inflation eroded half of that. So really, even after you got back, really it was only about 2019, 2020 when people would say, okay, with inflation, I finally actually made something. And it took
mhm,
20 years. So remember that one fact is that you could throw your money in the market because you're like, I got to do something with it. And that's a mistake that a lot of people make as amateurs is that they'll throw their money into something, anything, just to make money, and then they lose money. 0% is not your worst rate of return. It's better to keep it safe. Even earning point nothing percent at your bank is still better than nothing. But it's not a permanent home, as you're pointing out, right? Because you are going to lose. You're not going to make much money. So as you start to build that money up, then you get it out to invest. And there's investments that I mean, there's one that's advertised on our show that's a minimum investment of $1,000.
uh,
Now they may only pay about 8% a year, but still, that's a decent rate of return, paying pretty consistently. There's other investments. Most investments are going to be at least 25 to 50 grand in this alternative space. This Main Street investing versus Wall
mhm,
Street investing. Where you're not in the stock market. So, like for example, I can go put a down payment on a property for about 25, 30, maybe $40,000 and cash flow probably a couple $100 a month or more potentially. There's things like that. I can go invest there's an oil investment that we're getting into right now where the first year it's not going to cash flow much. We might make 1 or 2%. Year two, roughly probably about 20%, that next year, especially as the cash flow and passive income continues to increase as time goes on. I'm doing raw land right now. I have a partnership in that one where I don't do the investing of the raw land, but they're using my money to invest it. We buy the properties, and then we turn around and we sell it at retail prices to anybody, whoever wants it. Could just be a simple person that just wants land to go play on or to go shooting or whatever they want to do or to build something on. It could be a builder that wants to buy it from you, but we sell at retail prices, but they pay us back like we're the bank. We'll finance it to them for 5 or 10 years, like we're the bank, giving them a mortgage.
mhm,
And so what happens is that, even though I might buy a property for $5,000, we could sell it for 20,000 and they might be paying me about $300 a month, or $400 a month. So I'm making a killing. I make my money back usually within a couple of years, and not to mention all the other stuff too. So that one, for example, I've invested that in the last 2 years, about almost $400,000 total invested, yet we're cash flowing about $9,700 a month,
mhm.
right? So there's just so many different ways that we can invest. There's self-storage units, there's apartment buildings, although I wouldn't do apartments right now, just as a warning, wait a little bit before we go back to the apartment space because that's been pretty hurt the last couple of years.
Mhm.
But there's just so many different options you can do, even what that's backed by real assets like real estate, and you can get in many cases, if it's not, sometimes it can vary on the income, but a lot of times you can get a contractual return.
Mhm.
You can get a return that says this is what we're going to pay you because you're not the one doing the investing. Somebody else is doing the investing. You're just getting paid because you might be the one financing that project, or you might be the one that's an equity partner, or you might be a debt partner where you're getting paid that certain return. That's the great thing is that it can become so much more predictable, so much easier
Mhm.
than you could ever do. Just like the guy that had $1 million, instead of living on 30,000 a year, he's now making between 100 and 130,000 a year doing that.
So it sounds like, to an extent, you said you're being your own bank. You're buying property for cash, selling it at retail prices, but taking back paper, basically a take back mortgage at
Mhm.
a favorable interest rate. So you make back your money fairly early, at least as far as your principal is concerned, and then everything after that is profit and growth.
Yeah.
Your point about a zero rate of return isn't the worst, and the idea of the market tanking and then taking years to come back. Isn't that assuming that you do nothing, you just wait for it to come back? If you've got a market that drops and you
Mhm.
continue to invest and buy, okay, that market over time is going to come back. And as
Mhm.
the stocks that you bought at the low point rise in price, you can have a significant rate of return on that correction back up again, and not just make your money back, but make significant amount of money more than that. So to an extent, it's a matter of how long when you need the money. So it's not something you really want to do when you're 55 or 60, but if you're in your 20s, putting something into the stock market where you can tolerate 40 years of ups and downs and you continue to steadily invest in it so that the rate of return on equities that you purchase during a low market give you a good rate of return. So wouldn't it
Yeah.
be fair to say that it can depend on when you need the money back, right?
Yeah, isn't that a nice little theory? The whole dollar cost averaging and all that stuff. It's I mean, that's the thing is that they tell you you're in it for the long haul. But if the market goes down right before you're trying to retire, how long
Mhm,
does your long haul become? And that's what happened to my dad. Remember, it was Y2K did not help his portfolio.
mhm.
When I met with him, it had been coming back. The market was coming back up again, but it wasn't enough because the market went down again, going into that next recession, right? He really had to work into his 70s before he was finally forced into retirement due to health reasons.
But
Like
that's
he had to
assuming
keep
again
working.
you leave your money in growth stocks and things like that
Uh-huh.
with volatility, as
And that's
opposed
what
to
they're recommending now.
in the years running up to retirement, you start rebalancing your portfolio into income producing stocks from growth stocks,
Mhm.
where it's a lot more stable and your risk tolerance is lower. So
Yeah,
that
they
as
still
you
lost
approach
money
that
though.
time, if the
Yeah.
market tanks, you
Mhm.
have some of your portfolio retaining value, kicking out income, while you
Mhm.
have maybe some money in Roth that you don't have to take out right away,
Mhm.
that you can let it ride until the market recovers as a hedge against inflation. So yeah, I guess
Right.
it points out that any kind of portfolio is not set it or forget it. You have to
Mhm.
regularly monitor it. You need to change your balance as your risk tolerance changes,
Mhm.
life changes comes in, and things like that. So our listeners should understand this is something you got to keep an eye on and review at least once a year.
At least. The hard thing is that even financial advisors today don't even tell you to do that anymore. They're
Hmm.
actually telling you, no, stay in the market. Just keep it in
Yeah.
the market. Yeah, you might put a little bit in bonds, but keep the vast majority in the stocks. Here's the problem. It happened in the Great Recession and it happened even in 2022, which was the first real down year we had since 2009. And it only
Uh,
happened for 1 year. Just so you know, the average is 2 years up, 1 year down has been the historical average. We've had in the last 15 years, 14 years up, 1 year down. That's kind of skewing the numbers off a little bit.
yeah.
So that's why a lot of advisors, especially the ones that have been around only a decade or less, they're saying, well, just keep it all in the market because it's great. Well, of course
Yeah.
it is, you little young buck, because you haven't had any experience, but the
Yeah.
problem is even in 2022, stocks went down, equity, even value stocks went down and bonds went down. Everything went down. And it happened in the last recession too. So the
Mhm.
problem is that we're told to quote unquote diversify, right?
Right.
The truth is when you're in paper assets, you're not diversified, even if you're getting different types of paper assets. They all go down together in many cases. Sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes
Mm.
bonds might stay up, but we've witnessed that even when stocks have gone down, bonds go down too. And as a financial advisor, they told us that never happens, but it does. It does happen. So it's still a big gamble. And that's why if you're going to diversify, you could still keep money in the market. I have a client right now that they came to us with $5 million, most of it in like Meta, like Facebook stock,
Right.
Google, Tesla, those kind of things. And we're like, that's scary. Even though the SP 500 now, if you try to buy the SP 500, even that is almost all the Magnificent Seven, right? It's like 30% weighted to just seven companies only, really six companies, because two of the seven are both Google. But
Ah,
so they tell you, oh yeah, well it's diversified. No, it's not. If those tech stocks tank, the SP goes down worse than the
mm,
overall average of the market, right? So you got all this kind of gamble, but they did the same thing. They said, all right, let's move some money into real estate. Let's do some of that. They still kept some stocks, and I'm okay if they're going to do that. But at least now we got their passive income to about a couple hundred grand a year. that we help
Mm.
them improve their cash flow by, so that they have that option. Most people don't. Most people don't have that much money sitting in stocks or mutual funds. They're just trying to make it to the point where they think they can finally do it. But
Mm.
again, what happens if the market tanks right about the time you're trying to retire? And even if it doesn't, even if you're trying to diversify, now you're making a less and less return while inflation's still pretty dang high. You're thinking, am I really gaining any ground? And so you really do need big returns. I would say at least double digit returns, but at the same time, you need lower risk, right? And the problem is with the market, it's usually high risk, mediocre returns. And
Mm.
that's the unfortunate thing. That's why so few people are able to really have a good lifestyle when they have their money in the stock market.
Mhm. Well, just to wrap up the last question I have, and oftentimes people say, "Oh, this is great, Chris. I'd love
Mhm.
to, invest all this money and have this great rate of return, but where do I come up with the money to invest?" All right,
Yeah.
where do you come up with the funds? Do you have any ideas for our listeners on ways that they can free up funds and maybe find money that they might not have known is there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a few of them. I do have like an ebook on our website, moneyripples.com, that talks about the 7 secrets to free up cash today. I actually learned that during the last recession because I was going broke during the last recession as well and had to battle my way back.
Uh-huh.
And I helped hundreds of other clients do the same thing too in that period of time. One is really start tracking your money. Be a wise steward of your money. Again, you don't have to, be cheap, but you do need to actually monitor it. So start to track it on a weekly basis if you can,
Uh-huh.
at least monthly, minimum monthly, but I would do it at least weekly, just to stay on top of where your money's going. Just by doing that, you don't even
Uh-huh.
have to get cheaper. Just by watching your money, you'll probably find at least a few hundred extra dollars a month just naturally because you're watching it. Whatever you ignore will leave you. Whatever you pay attention towards will tend to increase. So watch your cash flow. Find ways to keep increasing your income. Find ways to keep creating value, whether you're a business owner, whether you're an employee, it doesn't matter. Same principle is that dollars follow value. The
Mm.
more value you offer somebody, the more you can serve or solve problems for them, the more you get paid.
Mm.
And that's been true since the beginning of time, no matter the market. Even Warren Buffett just said it last year. He said, if you want to beat inflation, find ways to increase your income by becoming more valuable, right? Increasing your skill sets, doing things to, again, deliver more value. That's one thing that's limitless. We can cut down expenses only so far and then living in a cardboard box, but
Right.
increase that income, that's limitless, right? Um,
And
yeah,
that's
go
where
ahead.
passive income becomes important because there are only
Yeah.
so many hours in a day.
Hmm.
Time is finite. So if you're going to increase your income and continue to increase your income, you either have to get paid more per hour or find ways to disconnect money from time, which is what passive
That's
income
right.
is. So would you say that generating passive income is probably the best way to do that to increase income because you're not spending more time?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to do it, especially if you have the money. Now, if you have no money, the
Yeah,
passive
that's the
income piece,
question.
yeah,
That's the
I'll be
catch-22.
frank. You exchange one of two things if you want passive money, right? Or if you want more income coming in. Is either you exchange time and energy or you exchange money.
Uh-huh.
That's really what you got. If you don't have the money, it's gonna be some time and energy. But like you said, I like your point because it doesn't always require more hours, right? It's about more value.
Uh,
Because I mean that's one thing I learned early on when I remember my friend said, "Do you like doing mortgages?" Because I was a mortgage broker, and I said, "I like teaching it, but I really don't like doing the paperwork." And he said, well, find somebody to do the paperwork. And in a scarcity world, especially when I was a financial advisor, I would never refer anything to anybody because I would lose out on, I'd be, losing money, right? I want to be cheap. So I'd be cheap and sacrifice all this extra time to try to be cheap, and just do everything myself. But when he said that, I said, well, yeah, does anybody like doing paperwork? He says, trust me, there are nerds out there that like paperwork. Well, long story short, I go to my broker. I asked the owner of that brokerage, I said, who fits this description? He says, Clark does. Because anybody with the name Clark is nerdy enough to be a
ah,
paper lover, right? So, so good old Clark, I go to him. I said, listen, if I send you people that I've taught them what to do with their mortgages, talking about like even like refinance, use it to invest and things like that, they're excited to get a mortgage. Would you be willing to do the mortgage for me? He said, yes. I'm like, and will you split me 50-50? And he said, yes. So I was licensed, so I could do that, right? Like I know, like with you, there's licensure, you have to be careful
right.
with that kind of stuff. But I had a lot mortgage license. I just passed on to Clark. So I started spending less time dealing with mortgages, but I was making the same or more money. which was ironic because, I would be the bleeding heart. I would cut down my fees and commissions to try to be a good person. Clark would just charge the standard 1%, and he would just do that. So I was splitting it 50-50, but getting paid just as much as I was before, but now I wouldn't spend all the time doing it. So there's ways to leverage time. If you don't have the money and you don't have the time, then who do you know, right? It's the who, not how, as Dan Sullivan talks about, right? Who do you know that can actually help you to deliver more value? And that's, I think, a secret untapped income source that most people never realize.
Unless you're Clark.
Unless you're Clark. Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah.
even Clark had to work more hours.
That's what I'm saying. Clark had to work more hours because he's doing the
Yeah.
paperwork. I think, for a 50-50 split, you got the better end of the deal because you're bringing in more business, et cetera, and you're making half. And you can do that more and more with the same amount of time, but it still takes this, unless he can automate it or make it more efficient, takes the same amount of time to process the paperwork. So he's spending more time to make the more money. It's still, money is still tied to time for him.
Well, that's why you want to find somebody, if you do that kind of partnership, find somebody who's weak where you're strong and strong where you're weak, right? Because I didn't like the paperwork. I had no passion for it, and I was slow at doing it. He was fast, but he didn't like trying to find new clients. That was the thing that just drained him and scared him. So to have somebody say, here, I'm going to feed you clients, and they were just friends and family. It was very occasional, but still feeding him friends and family and clients, because I said, hey, they're ready to go. You don't have to sell them anything. You just have to do it. For him, that was a dream come true. Yeah. So that's where it became a win-win for us. It was a win for me because I didn't have to do paperwork, but a win for him because he didn't have to find clients.
Well, that's great. A lot of good information. And if people, what is it you do for people? And if people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
Yeah, we do two different things. Like we've talked about the passive income consulting and things like that, kind of more creating an anti-financial plan, right? In that sense. And then we even do like a strategy called infinite banking that we use to help amplify the returns on people's investments too. So that's another strategy we use. And you can just go to moneyripples.com. There's a whole bunch of free information you can find on there, as well as our podcast, the Money Ripples podcast.
And you said that there was an ebook or something that people can get?
Yeah, the ebook Beyond Rice and Beans is on there somewhere on the site, I'm sure, but I don't even remember where it is anymore, but I know it's on there. And that's a great book you can also access to.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put the links in the show notes, folks, so you can get access to that, all of that information, and reach out to Chris if you think he'd be of assistance to you and as being your anti-financial advisor. So thanks for coming on the show, Chris. A lot of different thinking on this subject that I'm sure will be a lot of interest to our listeners.
Yeah, appreciate that, Steve.
All right.